All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Stan Odenthal. I am the Director of Business Relations for Heartland Workforce Solutions. And welcome to this webinar today, this business workshop that we're hosting. I'd also like to introduce Vanessa Martinez Hernandez, who's going to co-host this with me as well. Vanessa, did you want to say anything?
I just wanted to say hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It's nice to see all of you.
Cool. Thanks, Vanessa. And so as we get started with this is part of our Better Business Workshop series. And so we started this series last year, had a lot of great topics and a lot of great feedback from from quite a few of our business partners. This year, we've got some great topics lined up for you. Today's topic is opening your business to people with disabilities. Our presenters are Natalie Hadley from Outlook Business Solutions and Paulette Monte from Outlook Enrichment. And so it should be a really great topic. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing and why we're doing it. But before we do that, let me launch a poll question. So this poll question just asks you if this is your first time attending one of our workshops or not. If you wouldn't mind just answering yes or no. We're just hoping to continue to build these better and better and continue to have great topics and get more people involved. So thank you for answering that. Good to see some first-time attendees. And then I'm kind of curious, one of the questions that I had, and I'm launching this poll question, is we know that there's lots of webinars out there, lots of workshops. How often on your schedule are you attending workshops, virtual webinars? And so the choices are daily, a few times a week, weekly, less than weekly, or this is my first webinar ever. It would be cool if this was their first webinar ever, but I doubt we get it. Okay, so it seems like a mix between few people that are some people that attend quite often and others that attend sporadically. And so that's good to know. So as we get into this, let me just introduce you a little bit to Heartland Workforce Solutions. We are the local workforce development area that receives the federal funds under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act for the counties of Douglas, Sarpy, and Washington counties. And so we're that connecting piece between a lot of workforce development programs, things like job training, business outreach, resume assistance, all of that fun stuff. We bring that together and serve individuals from those three counties. As part of that, we have our American Job Center at 57th and Ames. We'd love to invite you to visit that center. And as business owners and business representatives, there's a lot of great services that we offer to businesses. Vanessa, do you want to highlight some of the business services that we offer?
Sure. Sorry, everyone. Working from my phone, having some computer issues here at home today. So thanks for being patient with me. Some of the cool things that we're able to do with businesses is build training programs through some of our funding streams to help offset the cost that businesses might incur to get individuals trained into sustainable employment positions. So that's one cool thing that we offer. We also have regular events at our office that businesses can plug into, whether that's coming once a week to connect directly with job seekers who are coming into our office to talk about opportunities and hopefully allowing the employer to make on-the-spot job offers. We have spaces for interviews. If a business were to be on site and needed to interview candidates, we have space available to do that. And we also have regular ongoing events. Sometimes those are themed and we want to focus on specific areas for those, but we have several throughout the year that are open to all business types and opportunities. And all of the things that we offer at our office to businesses are at no cost to them. So all of the services that we provide, we never charge any fees or things like that. We're really just trying to focus on being intentional and making sure that individuals in the community can connect to the available opportunities.
And so, yeah, so there's a lot that we do, and just feel free to connect with us. The information's on the screen about some of the resources on our website at hws-ne.org. Also, you can call us, you can email us, just connect with us. As Vanessa mentioned, our services are free of charge because we are federally funded, and so that makes a difference, and we're able to do a lot of great things. And so as part of those great things, we've been doing these monthly business workshops. And so some upcoming events that you should be aware of. Next month, our topic is focused on staying in compliance with workers' rights. We have the Nebraska Department of Labor, their labor law division, coming to talk about a number of different workers' rights laws, and how to stay in compliance with that, whether it's things like lunchtime compensation and break time stuff, to exempt employees, to overtime hours, to you name it. We're going to be able to talk about it during that meeting. And so following that, in April, we've got our topic is related to SourceLink Nebraska. So if you're unfamiliar with that one, that is a brand new program housed at the University of Nebraska Omaha that's offering resources to small businesses and entrepreneurs throughout the state of Nebraska. And so they are gathering a host of resources and putting that together. Their website is pretty great. You may want to check that out, but they're going to be talking about some of their newer resources for small business owners. So with that, I want to hand it over to Natalie and to Paulette and let them take things away. And as they're presenting, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, or go ahead and put that question in the chat. There will also be some time at the end for additional questions. So cool.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. This is Natalie, and can somebody give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen, my slide? Thank you, Stan. So I am the blue-haired lady on the right of that slide. I am Natalie Hadley. I'm Vice President for Outlook Business Solutions, and I am joined today by Paulette Monty, and I'll let Paulette introduce herself.
And my name is Paulette Monty. I am the Executive Director of Outlook Enrichment. I'm also a certified Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. So that lends me a lot of knowledge and experience moving forward into today's presentation.
Awesome. So as the names might imply, Outlook Enrichment and Outlook Business Solutions are sister companies. So Outlook Enrichment is Paulette's business unit, and that is based in Omaha. They are a comprehensive rehabilitation agency for the blind. They have specialists in adaptive technology training, and they also do employment and workplace accommodation consulting. So you're going to get a taste of Paulette's very broad knowledge on workplace accommodations today. And then my entity is Outlook Business Solutions. We're a business growth agency based in Omaha, specializing in marketing and digital accessibility. We have a network of more than 30 talented professionals all over the country, most of whom happen to be visually impaired. And both of our entities are part of Outlook Collaborative, which is a social enterprise family of companies focused on providing earning and enrichment opportunities to people with vision impairment. So our content today, we're going to cover the missing piece of the DEI conversation, digital barriers to applicants with disabilities. I'm going to give you some quick tips for more accessible talent recruiting processes. Paulette's going to talk about accommodations, and then we'll take your questions. So here we go. So disability is really the missing piece of the DEI conversation. Over the last 3 to 5 years, we've seen a lot of public discourse on gender equality, racial equality, equality for people with sexual identity or sexual orientation. But we're not really always including disability in those conversations. In fact, the United Nations did a study and found that only 3% of media articles that discuss diversity reference disability, and the number is actually decreasing over the last 5 years. So we're not including disability in those conversations even as often as we used to be. But unlike gender, race, or sexual identity, disability is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. It is the true definition of intersectionality with the other aspects we see of DE&I. About 1 in 4 Americans, which is a total of about 61 million adults, live with a disability. But contrary to what I think most able-bodied people believe, the number of people born with a disability is fewer than 15% of the total. The vast majority of Americans who have a disability acquired that disability through disease or injury. And relevant to today's presentation, a little bit on employment. So we have a labor shortage right now and almost 11 million unfilled jobs. And yet the unemployment rate for people with disabilities generally tends to be about double the overall unemployment rate. And for people who are visually impaired, which is the primary disability that Paulette and I work with, it is triple the overall unemployment rate. And if you think that this is just an old people problem, consider this. 1 in 4 of today's 20-year-olds will become disabled before they reach retirement age. So we're not just talking about disability in terms of our aging bodies. We're talking about disability that comes from accidents, that comes from disease, that comes from other causes. And we need to factor that in when we're talking about today's labor force. Disability inclusion is actually good for business. Accenture did a study in 2018 and found that companies that are actively trying to include people with disabilities in their organizations had 28% higher revenue, double the net income, and 30% higher economic profit margins over companies that were not being proactive about hiring people with disabilities. And also from the Accenture study, disability inclusion is good for the national economy. The US economy could get a boost of up to 25 billion if more people with disabilities were to join the workforce. And that 25 billion is based on a 1% increase in the number of people with disabilities who are actually working. So for my portion today, I'm going to talk about your hiring practices and whether you are unintentionally screening out applicants with disabilities. So a little bit on digital accessibility. Digital accessibility is really just making sure that everything is accessible to someone regardless of whether or not they're using assistive technology. So there's actually making your website, making your practice accessible actually decreases your legal risk. The most famous or well-known case right now in the disability accessibility front for digital accessibility is the Domino's pizza case. The case started out in 2016 with a blind customer who wanted to use the Domino's app to order a pizza and found that he could not do that, and tried the website. That was also not accessible. So he phoned in his order, and Domino's would have gladly taken his order over the phone. However, they would not allow him to use a coupon that was only available to people who ordered through the app or the website. So the gentleman sued Domino's. In October of 2019, that case went to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied hearing the case, denied certiorari. And so the case went back down to the lower court. Domino's has since settled on some aspects of the lawsuit, but it's not completely over yet. So the next slide I'm going to show you, these numbers are actually from around the end of 2019. So Domino's had 2 more years of litigation on top of this. So the estimated cost of Domino's legal fees through the end of just 2019 was $6 million for this one case. And professionals in the accessibility space have estimated that in 2016, it would have cost Domino's somewhere around $32,000 to make both the app and the website accessible. So you can see that there's definitely a better cost associated with accessibility versus fighting those claims in court, not to mention the reputational damage. I've tried to find some measurements of the reputational damage or the loss of goodwill that Domino's has suffered. I haven't been able to find a quantitative measurement of that. UsableNet does a survey twice a year on the number of cases that are being filed at the federal level that are specific. They're ADA cases specific to digital accessibility. And you can see that that number is increasing over time. It was a little bit flat in 2018 as everyone kind of waited to see what the US Supreme Court was going to do on that Domino's case. once the US Supreme Court turned that case away in October of 2019, you can see the number of cases has been rising to where we, last year in 2021, we were at a rate of over 10 cases per day, which was a 15% increase in 2020. So it's not just about legal risk, right? It's about doing the right thing and putting your best foot forward when it comes to hiring. And so this was an actual social media post I saw from a company, a software company, senior staff architect who is disabled. She uses a wheelchair and she is also hard of hearing. And she said, people with disabilities, here's a super pro job searching tip. When trying to decide whether to apply for a job, look for two things. Does the company mention disabilities on its JEDI, DEI, DIB diversity page? Does the company have an accessibility statement in its footer? If the answer to both of these is no, you are kidding yourself to think that organization will be an environment where you don't have to worry about what people think about your disability. So within the disability community, there are advocates and leaders who are saying, hey, don't even apply for a job if a company doesn't talk about disability as part of its DE&I program or have an accessibility statement in the footer of its website, because disability is just not on the radar for that organization.
Hey, Natalie, just a follow-up question to that. How often is that the case? I mean, could you put a number on it, kind of a percentage of companies that don't have that as part of their...
I don't have that stat. That's a great idea, Stan, and I'm going to make a note of that and see if I can find that statistic. I would say just on an everyday user level, my own searches on the website and interacting with different websites, I would say we're maybe 20%. Paulette, what would you guess? Number of companies actually have an accessibility statement?
I would agree with that. And the ones that you do tend to see a statement like that are often organizations or health clinics that typically are serving a wider range of people with disabilities. So they're directing it more towards the consumer of the service as opposed to the employees who actually are entering as a job applicant into their system.
So again, what is digital accessibility? It just means everybody has access to the same information, regardless of what kind of technology they may use or other tools they may use to access that information. So that includes your forms, graphs, guides and manuals, pictures, videos, all the things you see on the screen, trainings, documents, meetings, infographics, all need to be accessible to people with disabilities. So where do we typically see the most barriers when it comes to digital accessibility? I'm going to focus a little bit today primarily on websites and forms, because in a hiring process, those tend to be the two formats that applicants will most often encounter. So for digital accessibility on a website, just some quick tips, using headers correctly. So when you select that H1 or H2 heading style, it doesn't just tell the page what font and what size of type to use. It's actually a navigation tool to help someone using screen reader technology to skim the page. So a screen reader user can use a setting in their screen reader to read just the H1 level headings on the page or just the H2 level, much the way that a sighted person will use headings, subheadings, and other visual cues on the page to skim the page. So when headings are not used correctly, it makes it more difficult, takes longer for a person using screen reader to navigate the page. Images should be labeled with alt text or coded as decorative. So a lot of images aren't really important to the context of the information being relayed. They're sort of eye candy. And those images can actually be coded as decorative, so screen reader skips over them. But where an image is important to the message, it needs to have alt text, and that alt text needs to provide a good context. So I have an example in another deck that I use of if you had an image labeled as student using microscope. That could be a young African-American grade school age girl using a microscope because we're talking about getting more females and females of color into STEM careers, or it could be a doctoral student using the latest, greatest, fanciest scientific microscope in a lab at a university where they're trying to recruit doctoral students. So that context is important. Form input fields labeled in the right location. So we often see form fields where you have like 3 fields in a row, and then the names of those fields are below the fields. That can be problematic for the screen reader because it can't associate the correct label with the correct field. It's reading top to bottom and left to right. So it's actually going to read editable field, editable field, editable field, and then first name, middle name, last name, which can make it very confusing for someone trying to fill out the page, the form. Buttons and links should be labeled with enough information to stand alone for navigation. Again, with screen reader, you can skim a page using just the links. You can have it just read the links that are on the page. Well, if all the links say learn more or read more or click here, it doesn't provide any context to the user of which link to click on to get the additional information they need. Definitely need to have sufficient color contrast. And also I learned this from Paulette, making sure that you're not bouncing things from one side of the screen to another. For a person who uses magnification now, not only do they have to scroll up and down, but they have to scroll left and right. And they may miss things like a back button in the lower left corner and a next button in the lower right corner. If they've magnified the screen, they may lose one or both of those off the screen. And then for hearing impaired, definitely making sure that videos have closed captioning, a transcript, or both. And it's not just for people who are hard of hearing. The vast majority of video today is consumed with the sound off. And then transcriptions are really handy for people like myself who want to skim something quickly. I would much rather read a transcript than sit through a video. Transcripts also are really good for search engine optimization.
So there's a couple of comments here in the chat, Natalie, that I wanted to bring up.
Go ahead.
First one was related to kind of what we're doing right here with the presentation and needing to figure out a way for hyperlinks and alt text to work on PowerPoints over Zoom. I guess that would be problematic, right? With a Zoom presentation like the one that we're doing, unless like, I don't know, maybe we probably should have the closed captioning enabled at least at a minimum, right?
Right, so there are actually tools out there. There's a great tool called Scribe for Meetings. It's available from Numa Solutions. And once Paulette's on her part of the presentation, I can try to grab that link and share it out via the chat. Scribe for Meetings would take this PowerPoint deck and convert that into an accessible format for people who are print impaired. So print impairment isn't just vision. Sometimes it's a learning disability that makes it easier for someone to look at a print document than watch on a screen. Scribe, the way Scribe works is you set your presentation up with Scribe, and then it provides you a link. You drop that link in the chat, and then if you have a visually impaired user or a print impaired user, they can click on that link and choose from 8 different formats to receive the presentation deck. Closed captioning, definitely if you're going to put out content where it's pre-recorded, you can do captioning after the fact. One of the challenges right now with live captioning is just the accuracy. Paulette, maybe you know better best practices. What I usually tell people is we have closed captioning available if anybody would like me to turn it on, and we can do that. For sighted users, I feel sometimes that the errors in the closed captioning can become something of a distraction. So sighted people start watching that closed captioning to see what kind of funny or possibly even inappropriate thing the automated closed captioning comes up with. Paulette, do you have a best practice?
Ideally when you want to have something captioned, if somebody has requested that in particular, maybe they're deaf or hard of hearing, or they have, for example, a traumatic brain injury, And or their learning style may be just that they need to visually process information. You always want to not use the automated captioning, but have a live cart transcriber there. So that person would be typing as you are saying, and it's a lot more accurate. That also tells when there's multiple people on the conversation, it will identify, the live cart captioner will identify who the speaker is in answering the questions. And there's a couple services in our community that do it. I sit in a number of meetings that they do it. And I do find that it is easier for me to follow the conversation because I am a person who has a traumatic brain injury. And if I can't hear somebody clearly, I will revert to the captioning, but it also will show a live listing if I want to just see what the dialogue is and not look at all the slides.
And the link to Scribe is now in the chat. So thank you, Natalie, for putting that in there. The second question came from Vanessa. Are there any tools, websites, et cetera, that can help businesses and organizations check to make sure that the content they have is accessible?
So they
do you want to do that one or you want me to do that one?
Go ahead, Paulette.
There are tools available. However, the tools do not supplement a live person who is not eligible in a wide variety of disabilities, or having multiple individuals with disabilities check your site. There's been a lot of litigation out there against certain testing tools. The philosophy I use when looking at a website is I may use Wave, which is a great tool, to quickly identify things like if an alternative text tag is missing from an image, or to identify if something is not labeled correctly. But they do not always identify things. Color contrast is a good example of where they typically might fail during an evaluation process, because they are just looking at the color codes that are coming up on a website. They're not necessarily looking at the wide range of users and the disabilities that might have a problem seeing that. So for example, if it's red text on a red background, a pale red background with black text, well, it may pass the Wave test or one of the other testing tools, but it's not taking into consideration that maybe there's a lot of people who are colorblind out there, and red on black is a very difficult challenge because black and red look very similar. So they may not even pick up that there's text there because of the reading challenges that they have and experience. So there are tools out there that can help identify issues, but it does not pass the muster when it's compared to actually people who are trained in the skill sets to test a site.
Yeah, and I would just add to that companies need to be really careful about using plugins and overlays. There are several on the market that sort of promise silver bullet compliance with the ADA. There actually been some litigation recently against companies who were sued because the site wasn't accessible. They added the plugin and said, hey, we're accessible now. And then an expert witness came in and tested the site again and said, you're still not accessible. So be wary of those. I'm going to put a blog link into the chat from our friends at Converge Accessibility that talks about why you should be careful about plugins and overlays. So talking about documents and signatures, that's a big part of the whole hiring process. So document formats like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDFs can be made accessible if it's done correctly. Converting a document to PDF does not automatically make them accessible, especially if it's a form that you're making fillable. There's a lot that goes into labeling those form fields correctly and making sure that the page navigates in the correct order. Inserting boxes and graphics into Word documents, like doing a text box or inserting a graph or a chart or a photo can really cause problems with screen readers, because again, the screen reader will jump around instead of, it has a hard time following linearly what it should be reading. So it is best practice, as Paulette mentioned, to have your content reviewed by someone who uses screen reader or other accessibility tools every day, native assistive tech user. Electronic.
One of the things that we see a lot of times with documents that are scanned in particular, they'll be scanned in as an image, and that does not give the person who is visually impaired any information about what the content of that document is. It'll just say that it's an image. Now, the optical character recognition is getting better for some of these screen readers, but it's still not there, and it won't be 100% accurate. So if you're really wanting people to make sure that they're getting the content, you have to pay attention to how the document is scanned in the first place, and then making sure that it is accessible, especially in this time with so much. Natalie and I were talking about this yesterday, in a time when we're doing so much remote work and we are sharing a lot of documents in the workplace or to students, that they are being done in an accessible manner.
Great, thanks, Paulette. Electronic signature tools like Adobe Sign and DocuSign can work when when all you need is a simple signature. So like in what my company does, we use a lot of blind contractors. So we're usually sending out statements of work or agreements for them to sign. And when we pre-fill things like their address and name, and then just send it and have them sign, that can actually work really well. I think our HR department is starting to use that more with new hires and applicants who are visually impaired. And then again, if you're using automated tools that create fillable versions of Word or PDF forms, be sure to have the output tested to ensure that the experience is good and it's accessible for that user. So I'm going to fly through just a few more tips, and then I'll hand it off to Paulette. So have your recruiting and application processes tested by people with different disabilities to identify issues. So have somebody actually go through the processes if they were an applicant. And it's best if you can find someone who is hearing impaired to tell you what problems they may have, or somebody who has a mobility impairment and maybe can't use a mouse, can only use a keyboard. Build accessibility into your processes as a standard, not a one-off accommodation. So if we find a lot of times that companies wait until things are done and then they test them and find that they're not accessible, and then they have to go back and do a bunch of rework to make the form or the web page or whatever it is accessible. So addressing that from the beginning, there's an estimate from Level Access, had to think for a minute which company, that if you wait until a website is done and then address accessibility, it will add about 10% on average to the whole cost of building the site. But if you address accessibility during the user experience design and all the way through to the coding, it only adds between 1% and 3% to the cost. Ensure that disability is included in DEI conversations and initiatives to the same extent as gender, race, or sexual identity. I did a test on a large financial services company, I won't tell you which one, that just went through the site and searched for gender, found a lot of initiatives and content about women in financial services, was a financial services company, searched for ethnicity, race, finally multicultural was the word that they were using. So found a lot of content around that. Searched for disability, and the only things that it brought up was disability insurance policies, which was one of the things the company sold. So making sure to elevate disability to that same level. Again, don't assume accessibility plugins and overlays work. Verify that through testing, and I put the link in the chat to that article from Converge. And then don't assume that widely used business software or software as service solutions are accessible. Verify that through testing by people with disabilities. This is probably one of the biggest frustrations for me in hiring people that have a disability, whether it's full-time or as an independent contractor. It's just the everyday business softwares that we use aren't always accessible. You know, maybe it's a a contact management system. Maybe it's an accounting system or a marketing automation system, or a sales system. And you want to hire someone with disability who has all the other qualifications, but whatever that software is not accessible. So that should actually be part of your contractor or vendor vetting process. That should be one of the questions before you purchase software, making sure that the software is accessible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paulette. And Paulette, just tell me when you need me to advance the slide.
Okay. So now we're moving into kind of post-application phase. Maybe somebody has turned in an application and you're looking and you're reviewing the applications and going to be interviewing the person. So let's switch to the next slide, Natalie. So a lot of times when it comes to the pre-employment, there's a lot of questions about what kinds of things can you ask when somebody comes in for a job interview. So maybe it's fairly obvious when the person walks in that they have a disability. Maybe they're coming in and they are a wheelchair user, or they're coming in and they are using a dog guide. And it's pretty obvious that they have a disability from the get-go walking through your door. But there's a lot of people out there who may have hidden disabilities. So it's important that you think about what kinds of questions you have in the employment phase, in that pre-employment thing. So these are some acceptable things you can ask. You can ask whether the applicant has the ability to perform the specific job duties or the job functions within the job, making sure that you are also being very specific about what some of those job duties are, and asking the applicant to describe how they might complete the job task, or you can ask that they demonstrate in some situations how they might do the job task. So that's important that you're covering yourself in that early on phase and asking what the accommodations are. You may only request information about accommodations if the applicant has an obvious disability, or if the individual voluntarily self-discloses that he or she has a disability. Next slide. So again, when somebody is using a wheelchair dog guide, you may ask what kind of accommodation they may use. If it's obvious, hidden disabilities such as learning disabilities, mental health diagnosis, or other types of things like a traumatic brain injury may be hidden to you upon the person coming in. And at that time, if the person self-discloses in the interview, then you may ask more task-specific type of questions. Most people will already know what types of accommodations they might use on the job. If you are somebody who is working with people on interviewing skills or employment situations, what we recommend to the people who we work with in our employment program is, what is your plan? Look at those job duties, look at the functions, and before you even walk into the door for your first interview, be prepared to answer the questions on how you will do those tasks. Next slide. A lot of times it's really important to look at, is the individual who has a disability coming in, are they meeting the necessary job requirements? Do they meet the education, work experience, licensure, and certificates? Because that's going to, if it all is said and done, when you're looking at a comparison of whether the person was qualified for the position over another person's, these are the things that you need to be looking at. And these are also the things that if it, God forbid, your case goes to court or any type of litigation, these are also the things that those experts will be looking for to make sure and to determine if the person was qualified or not. Next slide. Okay. Who is required to provide accommodations? While it is great business practice to provide reasonable accommodations to anyone who is an employee for your organization, under the Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's 15 or more employees. Now, Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act has similar protections if you are a state or federal place of business. But the Americans with Disabilities Act is just one component. You also have to look at what Nebraska's state laws are that apply to employers. So that is an important aspect. The state laws will typically supersede the federal laws, and they may be more specific when you are working with, depending upon your state. So like California tends to have a lot more stringent regulations than some of our smaller states in the union. Next slide. What is a reasonable modification? A reasonable modification is an adjustment to the job tasks, practice, or the work that is provided. This makes it possible for the individual with a disability to have equal employment opportunities. And it also gives the individual with the disability to have barrier removal within the work environment so that they can perform those essential functions of the job. Okay, next slide. Evaluation of needs. This is where, as somebody who is the hiring facilitator, can become a little confused. So when you are looking at, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of people will know what types of accommodations that they're using for the job. And so they may come in with a list of these are what types of maybe software or equipment that what they would need to do on the job to perform it, such as a screen reader or Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a dictation software, refreshable braille display, or modifications to the workstation if they are somebody who utilizes a wheelchair. And other times, if it's something where they're doing job tasks that require them to be in a lot of meetings so that they can have equal access to seeing what is visually displayed on the screen, they might request an iPad or tablet for specific tasks. Or an iPad or tablet allows for a lot of hands-free types of things because there is voice movement on there that allows for communication, or a iPad or tablet can be used for communication access. Next slide. What we were just talking about are a lot of things that are also higher end ticket items, but there's a lot of low tech cost solutions that can work in a workplace. So it may be, for example, written materials in an accessible format. That could be sending somebody the documents prior to meetings so they can enlarge it or have access to it on that iPad or tablet. Could also be just simply before you send something to your staff for a meeting and you want to make sure that the agenda is in accessible format, enlarging it in large print. And usually when we say large print, that typically is 16 point or higher. Modifications to the policies. So maybe your employment facility doesn't allow dogs on the premises. You might have to make some modifications to the policies or procedures in the workplace to allow a dog-eyed or seizure dog or a signal dog to be allowed to be on the premises. Modifications of an employment test. This could be if you have somebody who has a cognitive functioning disability and they may need to have the test read to them. Again, these are not high cost options, but it may require some personnel to assist the person to do the task, or driver reimbursement for transportation. So sometimes there are very low cost solutions to providing an accommodation, and sometimes you really do have to think about outside of the box and sit down with the person to really determine what some of the best solutions are. And they may not be readily apparent. This may be a trial and error process as you are in those first few months with a person as new tasks and new things come up. Next slide. Choosing the right accommodation. Again, we said that sometimes it's important to look at, when you are looking at the person, what the application process is, looking at the essential job functions and how those tasks could be completed, but also looking at removing barriers to benefits and privileges. So if your facility has open to all of the staff a cafeteria, is the cafeteria line accessible to somebody who utilizes a wheelchair? Or if you have free tickets to venues, Are those open to everybody? And what is the process for somebody requesting the ticket for an event? For example, do your health benefits, are they going to be more jaded towards somebody who has a physical disability or has a long history of medical conditions? Those are some of the things that when we talk about required to remove the barriers in areas, that is some of the things that we do address in looking at equality in the workplace. Next slide. Selection criteria. When choosing accommodations, there's a lot of things that you need to first consider. As we mentioned, the person may have their own recommended accommodation that they're already familiar with. And when you're looking at the accommodations, you also have to think about what the law says. And the law says, you know, if there are two comparable solutions, that the employer has the right to choose the accommodation if it is comparable. So for example, one of the things I like to use about this is there's CCTVs that are magnification devices that can be used in the workplace. And some are very high end and have lots of features, and some are lower end that have maybe 1 to 3 color options, but they have the same magnification. So an employer in that situation may choose the lower end closed circuit camera for enlargement purposes, just because it fits into their budget a little better. Does it fulfill the need? Will it get the job done? Yes. Where it becomes a little more tricky is looking at some of the specialized software that is out there. For example, if somebody is looking at Dragon Naturally Speaking versus your IT people think Cortana on your computer might do the same functions. They are vastly different. I would never recommend Cortana to somebody who was coming in for any evaluation because it does not have all the same editing, functioning, and capabilities that Dragon Naturally Speaking, that's a program that's been around for over 30 years, has. So there's some things that you have to look at, as well as how much time would be taken out of the person's job to learn that new device or that new piece of equipment that they're unfamiliar with. And that time lost is something that you have to factor into this equation. So you have to also look at, is the task a function essential or marginal to the job duties? So if it's an essential function that's listed in the job description, that may be something that you would consider. But if it's marginal, so if, for example, if you have a team member who is deaf and hard of hearing, and occasionally you need that people in your team to cover for a person who sits at the front desk in the office, that's a marginal job duty. There's other people who could do it, and it's not part of that individual's essential functions. So that has to be factored in when you are looking at the requirements. If a task is required, also think about at what frequency, and that gets into is the function essential or marginal. But if it's something that's only done once a year or every quarter, then maybe that task can be looked at as a more marginal task rather than essential task. Then you also have to look at, are there health risks? And the only way to truly get over a health risk, if you are considering whether to hire somebody because there may be a health risk, is you actually have to do a full functional assessment to determine if the person, if that disability would cause a health risk to the environment. And then factor in equality. Is what you are proposing, is the person, what they are requesting, is it going to promote equality in the workplace? Next slide. Title 1 of the ADA covers employment, and the main purpose is to remove barriers with preventing qualified individuals with disabilities from enjoying the same employment opportunities available to a person without disabilities. It's all about equality. Next slide. So employment practices, and there's a lot of really great information out there. There's the Great Lakes ADA Center has some webinars that they do weekly that can give you some great information on employment. If you want to get more information, the Rocky Mountain ADA Center has some really great courses on Title I of the ADA, as well as business practices. And it goes over some of the things that we talked about today. But always make sure that when you are looking at employment practices that are covered within the ADA, that includes job accommodation, application processing, hiring, firing. It also covers things that are internal to your organization once the person has been there for a time. So advancement and compensation. You need to make sure that you are providing all accommodations for any trainings that your staff are attending that are internal to your organization. And then other terms and conditions and privileges of employment. That's your benefits packages, anything like that has to be comparable to somebody else within the organization. Next slide. Total cost for employers to accommodate a disabled employee. This is fairly nominal. At one time, when we looked at some of the initial studies that came out in the early 90s by Peter Blank and the Sears studies, on average, a lot of the accommodations were as minimal as $50 per person. The average now that we're seeing is 56% of accommodations cost nothing. 39% of accommodations had a one-time cost. That's a lot of times if it's an equipment purchase or a barrier removal. Average cost of a one-time accommodation is just $500. Next slide. And while we talk about the cost of accommodations and the barriers, keep in mind that there's a lot, the system is set up so there's advantages to you for hiring a person or to help minimize the cost to providing your accommodations to your staff. So there are some internal revenue tax codes and incentives to allow you to access some credits for providing those accommodations. So for businesses with 30 or fewer full-time employees or with a total revenue of 1 million or less in the previous year, there's tax credits available. So look at section 190 of the IRS code. If you know that your company is already providing accommodations to somebody, you may want to make sure that they're aware of this or that they know that they do have some tax codes available, because the amount that you're allowed is up to $15,000 per year. So a lot of those accommodations, unless it's a huge remodeling job, will be covered within that $15,000. And those accommodations don't have to be barrier removal or equipment related. This could be also if you are providing an interpreter for your staff meetings for somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, or if you need to specialize in sending out some materials for a training to have transcribed in Braille, that would be another accommodation that could be used as a tax credit. Next slide. Questions?
Yeah, thanks for that overview, Paulette. You know, one of the things that's on my mind is, you know, this has been fantastic. You guys are certainly experts in this area. What are some of the services that Outlook Nebraska is able to directly offer to businesses so that we can be that connecting point to connect businesses with some of the services that you offer?
I'll let you go
Natalie
first.
Start there first.
Oh. We're like Chip and Dale. No, after you. So for Outlook Business Solutions, we provide marketing services, consulting, everything from consulting all the way to just designing logos or graphics or helping you write blogs, that kind of thing. On the other part of our company is digital accessibility services. So we offer testing and consultation on making digital properties more accessible. We offer that both on a project basis, and then we have a subscription program. If you go to our website, which is up there on the screen, and go to Ally Support, you'll see our disability accessibility services provided there, but we can assist with document remediation, testing software, you know, really kind of anything in that regard. Paulette?
So some of the things that we can assist with Outlook enrichment, they tend to be more for the relationship between the employer or the employee. What we can do is come in and walk through your facility, look at what kinds of barrier removables might be needed if you are looking at hiring or you have somebody on staff who is visually impaired, making sure that, for example, your signage is at the right height level. If there's obstacles that may prevent a hazard to the consumer, we can talk about those kinds of things and walk your staff through some of those kinds of things, as well as we can evaluate the workspace, some of the equipment that's needed for a job. We can do an assessment on somebody to determine what our recommendations would be for the individual. And it may be something as simple as recommending, instead of using Chrome, that they might use Firefox, because most of what you are doing for the tasks and the job duties is a web-based page that they would be entering information into. For example, we had somebody from the UPS store that was a recommendation we made for them, because a lot of the things that he was doing was just through the web base, but Chrome has some flexibility in changing font size, color, contrast, and some of those kinds of things. So that was a really simple, no cost accommodation. Other times it might be evaluating somebody, maybe they are working with Microsoft Teams and they need to have training on Microsoft Teams, because I'll tell you, folks, in a world with remoteness, Microsoft Teams is not the most accessible program in the world, and we have to really look at a lot of workarounds to get it to work effectively with screen readers. So there's some things that we can help educate the IT team or the managers with, looking at what the best methods are, looking at modifications to the day-to-day practices are.
It's fantastic, yeah. And then one final question, as we're running short on time here. So how long has Outlook been around, and is it just for the Omaha metro area, or does it have a bigger reach than that?
We can go anywhere.
Yeah, Outlook, the organization that started us all, has been around for 20 years. Outlook enrichment is, while we provided services initially under Outlook Nebraska, we have been around as our own standalone agency since 2019.
Yeah, same for us. We're actually primarily a remote company to begin with. So we have, there are 5 of us in Outlook Business Solutions. We are another sister company to Outlook Nebraska. There are 2 of us that are here in Omaha, and then 3, we joke that we have 5 employees and we have 4 offices nationwide: Manhattan, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, and Indian Trail, North Carolina.
Oh, wow. Seems like fun places to visit. So one more question, sorry, it just came up in the chat. If someone was visually impaired, what tools are used to help the speaker present from a PowerPoint?
I know for our accessibility testing manager, who is totally blind, he uses Braille display, and it's actually a pad with bumps on it that adjust to produce Braille. And so he can have the Braille display actually go through his notes. So he's reading with his fingers from the Braille display. Paulette?
Other times somebody might emboss their notes or the slide information prior to a meeting. I'm visually impaired myself, and so I have a copy of the slides that's in large print on my desk, so I can see it more clearly, because I can't see all the time always what's on the screen. So I have just an alternate copy here that, as Natalie was going through her slides, I was following through on my paper copies, just because it's easier than trying to read it on the screen.
All right, I think that answers that question. Thank you again for presenting with us today. On your screen, you can see the contact information for both Natalie and Paulette. And so I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that, like I mentioned at the start, we do these on a monthly basis. Next month is going to be a great topic related to staying in compliance with workers' rights. So I encourage you to attend that one. That'll be on March 17th, 2021. So again, I want to thank Paulette and Natalie for the time and effort that they put into this presentation. They've got some great resources there at Outlook. And so thank you again. And I hope everybody has a great Thursday. Bye.